The guns of the Great War had fallen silent, but the silence was an illusion. Beneath the ruins of empires, anger smoldered, nations bled, and economies crumbled. From that chaos, voices of revenge began to rise. Promises of glory, power, and a new world order. The world, weary and desperate, looked away, and in that silence, a storm gathered. A storm that would erupt into fire and steel, consuming the earth in the deadliest conflict humanity has ever known. This was the beginning of World War II. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, was meant to secure stability, but instead it poured salt into open wounds. Germany was forced to disarm, surrender its colonies, and pay crippling reparations that bled its economy dry. Once a proud empire, Germany was now shackled, humiliated, and blamed for everything. To many Germans, this treaty was not justice, it was betrayal. And betrayal has a way of planting seeds that grow into storms. But it wasn't only Germany that suffered. Across Europe, nations bled under war debts, their economies weakened beyond repair. France mourned the millions it had lost defending its soil. Britain, though victorious, emerged exhausted and broken. Even the victors tasted ashes. The so-called peace left behind a fragile world, cracked and unstable. And in those cracks, anger, despair, and hunger began to spread, setting the stage for what would soon erupt into the deadliest war mankind had ever known. Germany, once an empire that stood tall among nations, was reduced to humiliation after 1919. Its army, once feared across Europe, was slashed to a fraction of its former strength, stripped of tanks, aircraft, and heavy weapons. Its navy, once proud, was dismantled piece by piece. For the German people, it felt like their honor had been stolen at gunpoint. They saw the treaty not as peace, but as punishment. And punishment breeds resentment that time alone cannot erase. The reparations demanded by the Allies tore through Germany's already weakened economy. Families starved as inflation devoured their savings bread that once cost marks could now cost billions. Children went to bed hungry, while parents looked upon them with despair. Poverty and shame became everyday companions. The bitterness of defeat mixed with the poison of hopelessness, forging a dangerous fuel that waited only for a spark to ignite. And yet, even in this darkness, whispers of defiance stirred. Veterans who had fought in the trenches spoke of betrayal of leaders who had stabbed the army in the back. Nationalists vowed that Germany's pride would rise again, that their humiliation was temporary, that vengeance would come. And though the world could not hear it clearly, deep within the heart of Germany, the embers of rage began to glow once more. By the late 1920s, the world seemed to breathe again. Economies slowly rebuilt, cities lit up with the promise of progress, and people dared to dream of peace. But dreams are fragile. In 1929, the stock market in New York collapsed, sending shockwaves across oceans. What began as a financial crash in America soon engulfed the entire world. Factories closed, banks failed, and unemployment spread like wildfire. The age of despair returned this time not with bullets, but with hunger. In Germany, the depression struck a nation already broken. Farmers lost their land, workers lost their jobs, and the government seemed powerless to stop the collapse. Families bartered for food, children stood in endless lines for bread, and fear consumed daily life. Democracy, once seen as hope, began to look weak, fragile, unable to protect its people. In that weakness, dark voices found their strength, voices that promised not just food and work, but pride and power. And it wasn't just Germany. Across Europe and Asia, chaos fed extremism. In Italy, Mussolini's fascist regime tightened its grip, proclaiming order and empire. In Japan, militarists declared their nation destined to rule Asia, seeking resources to feed their growing population. Around the globe, people turned to leaders who promised certainty in uncertain times. But certainty came with a cost the world would soon pay in blood and fire. While Europe's democracies hesitated, other powers moved boldly. In Italy, Benito Mussolini stood before cheering crowds, wrapped in black uniforms and promises of revival. He spoke of restoring Rome's ancient glory, of carving out a new empire that would make Italy great. His armies marched into Ethiopia in 1935, crushing resistance with modern weapons. The world condemned him, but words were no match for steel. Italy had tasted conquest, and it hungered for more. Far across the seas, Japan too had cast its eyes outward. Lacking natural resources, it sought to build an empire that would feed its growing industry and people. In 1931, Japanese troops stormed into Manchuria, carving out a puppet state under the rising sun flag. The League of Nations protested, but their protests were weak, empty, toothless. Japan ignored them and pressed on, proving that aggression went unpunished in a world desperate to avoid war. Both Italy and Japan set an example that others would follow. Their defiance showed that treaties and agreements meant little without the will to enforce them. The map of the world began to shift, one conquest at a time, as silence from powerful nations encouraged the boldness of the aggressors. And somewhere in the heart of Europe, a man watched these moves, carefully learning, waiting, and preparing for his moment to strike. In Germany, that man was Adolf Hitler, a failed artist, a soldier of the Great War, and a fiery orator who knew how to turn despair into power. With every speech, he painted a vision of rebirth, of a Germany that would rise from its humiliation, cast off the chains of Versailles, and take its rightful place as a world power. His words struck like thunder in the hearts of those who had lost hope. To many, Hitler was not just a politician, he was a savior. Through rallies lit by torches and banners, he crafted a movement that was more than politics. It was spectacle, it was faith. Propaganda painted him as Germany's chosen leader, the man destined to restore greatness. His party, the National Socialists, grew rapidly, feeding on anger, fear, and pride. Promises of jobs, strength, and unity drew millions into his fold, and those who opposed him were silenced step by step until opposition itself became dangerous. By 1933, Hitler rose to power as Chancellor of Germany. What followed was the transformation of a democracy into a dictatorship. Factories, once silent, roared back to life under rearmament. Streets, once filled with despair, now echoed with chants of unity. To the outside world, it seemed Germany had found its strength again. But beneath the banners and parades, a darker truth brewed, one that would soon drag the entire world into war. As Hitler tightened his grip on Germany, his first moves tested the resolve of the world. In 1936, German troops marched into the Rhineland, a direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles. The world held its breath, but no resistance came. France hesitated, Britain looked away, and the League of Nations, created to preserve peace, proved powerless. What should have been a stand became silence, and silence, in the face of ambition, is an invitation. Japan, emboldened by its conquest of Manchuria, pushed deeper into China in 1937. Cities burned, millions were displaced, and yet the world's protests were drowned out by the sounds of marching armies. Italy, too, had set its sights on empire, flexing its muscles in Africa while boasting of its restored greatness. These aggressions were warnings, signals of a storm on the horizon. But those who might have stopped it were too afraid of another war to act. In Germany, each gamble won without consequence gave Hitler more confidence. Every step he took, unchecked, sent a message not just to his people, but to the world that Germany was back and it would not be stopped. The rest of Europe watched, nervous but still hopeful, clinging to the fragile illusion that appeasing ambition might preserve peace. But history was already moving forward, faster than they realized. The leaders of Britain and France, scarred by the horrors of the Great War, dreaded the thought of another conflict. To them, compromise seemed the only way to prevent disaster. And so, appeasement became their shield, a shield made not of steel, but of hope and denial. When Hitler demanded Austria in 1938, the world looked on as German troops crossed the border unopposed. Austria fell, and the German Reich grew stronger, its people cheering as if destiny itself had returned. But it was in Czechoslovakia where appeasement revealed its cost. Hitler claimed the Sudetenland, a region with ethnic Germans, demanding it be handed over. Europe braced for war, but instead of resisting, Britain's Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain chose negotiation. At the Munich conference, he gave Hitler what he wanted, declaring that peace had been secured. Crowds in London cheered him as a hero, but in Berlin, Hitler smiled knowing the world would yield again. Appeasement was not peace, it was surrender dressed in diplomacy. Each concession strengthened the aggressors, weakening the defenders. By the end of 1938, Germany stood taller, bolder, and more dangerous than ever. And yet, the world still clung to the hope that Hitler's hunger would stop at one more border. But hunger never stops. It only grows. With Austria and the Sudetenland under his control, Hitler turned his gaze further. In March 1939, German troops marched into the rest of Czechoslovakia, breaking his promise made at Munich. This time, there were no negotiations, no disguises of diplomacy. It was conquest, plain and ruthless. The lie of appeasement was exposed, but it was already too late. Germany's appetite had become unstoppable, and the storm was now undeniable. Britain and France finally realized that Hitler's ambitions would not end with one or two territories. They began to prepare for war, though their armies were still unready, their people still fearful. For too long, they had looked away, and now they faced an enemy stronger than ever. Still, they issued warnings. If Hitler invaded another nation, there would be consequences. But warnings are only words, and Hitler had learned that words could be broken with impunity. The drums of war beat louder. Across Europe, people felt the tension in the air like a gathering thunderstorm. Families whispered in fear, leaders scrambled for alliances, and soldiers drilled with the uneasy knowledge that the peace they knew was about to shatter. And in Berlin, Hitler prepared for his boldest move, yet one that would drag the world into a conflict greater than anyone had imagined. On August 23, 1939, the world was stunned by news that seemed impossible. Germany and the Soviet Union, sworn ideological enemies, had signed a pact. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, as it was called, was a marriage of convenience, cloaked in shadows and secrecy. Publicly, it promised neutrality between the two nations. Privately, it contained a darker agreement, the secret division of Eastern Europe, with Poland marked as the first victim. The pact shocked the world. For years, Hitler had railed against communism, portraying it as Germany's mortal enemy. Stalin, on the other hand, had warned of fascism's threat. Yet now, both leaders shook hands, each calculating their own gain. For Hitler, the pact ensured that Germany would not face a two-front war. For Stalin, it bought time to rebuild his weakened military while securing territory promised in the secret clauses. The stage was set. The world held its breath as two great powers made their silent deal. To the west, Britain and France stood on edge, realizing that their warnings had failed. To the east, Poland stood in the crosshairs, unaware that its fate had already been sealed in the shadows of Moscow and Berlin. The storm was about to break, and when it did, it would consume the entire world. And so, on September 1939, the storm finally broke. German forces surged across Poland's borders, and within days, Britain and France declared war. The silence of the 1930s was shattered by the roar of tanks, the thunder of planes, and the march of millions. What began as ambition in the ashes of the Great War had now erupted into a conflict that would engulf continents, test humanity's limits, and forever scar the world. This was the beginning of World War II. But beneath the clash of nations lies a haunting question. Was this war inevitable, a path carved by humiliation, despair, and unchecked ambition? Or could it have been prevented had the world found its courage sooner? History leaves us with lessons, but also with mysteries. And those mysteries still echo across time, whispering through the ruins of cities and the silence of battlefields. Now we turn to you. What do you believe? Was World War II the outcome of careful planning by those hungry for power? Or the tragic failure of nations blinded by fear and pride? Share your thoughts below, for it is in reflection that we keep history alive. This is Battlefield Reborn, where legends are reborn. Subscribe, share, and let the world know the truth. The battlefield lives on, and the legends will rise again.